All right, we're on episode 17 as we continue to hear from Roger on his experiences over the past 99 years. One of the stories, Roger, I had heard after we stopped recording last time was about foreign workers.
Yes. In 1950, when I started working, we were not, I say we, the industry really was not automated. We were picking beans by hand. We were picking sweet corn by hand. We were pitching peas with a pitchfork in the field, haul them to the plant, run them through a viner, catch the peas, and put the pea vines on a stack. And that's what we were doing in 1950. Of course, we needed people to pick the corn. And I was thinking the other night I think it was 1952, we needed workers to pick our corn. So I called the U.S. Immigration Service. Now, I must have got this through the association activities, but I remember the fellow that worked for the U.S. Immigration Service. His name was Abe Clegg. I don't know if he was in Chicago or Milwaukee, but I told him we needed 40 workers, and we made arrangements to get 10 Jamaicans and 40 or 30 Barbadians. And we built a labor camp on one of our farms, a bunkhouse, and we used the farmhouse for the kitchen. We took a cook from amongst this 40 people to cook the meals, and I was involved with buying all the food according to the recipes they wanted beans and so on and so forth. And one thing I remember very vividly, one morning the fieldman, we had a guy in charge of the field operations, knocked on my door at 5 o'clock in the morning. He says, "Raj, they're ready to fight at the labor camp. The 10 Barbadians are on one side and the 10 Jamaicans are on one side and the 30 Barbadians on the other side." And Hannigan, who was a Jamaican, accused one of the Barbadians of stealing his billfold. And they were ready to fight. I think the Jamaicans could have cleaned up the whole 30 Barbadians, but anyhow, what do? So I said to Hannigan, "Were you sitting on the pickup truck, in the cab when you went to, I think it's Anthony Mugen's field in Cascade?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Okay, let's declare a truce until we get back." So I got in the pickup truck with the fieldman and Hannigan, and we drove to Anthony Mugen's field. That was about 5 miles away. And believe it or not, there laid the billfold on the ground. The guy got out of the pickup truck. It slipped out of his pocket. He had a smile. I can still see his teeth. He went back to camp. I ate breakfast with him, and everybody knew went to work. How can you imagine that?
So did you drive to the field through the fields or on the road?
On the road and down the lane, and I could see that billfold, I think, from a mile away. Now, I was hoping I would see that billfold. But everybody, I'll never forget that.
So what language did they speak?
They spoke English, but they also could pick corn. We'd have 8 fellows picking corn, 2 in front of the truck and 3 on each side. And we paid them $3.50 a ton for picking corn. And a crew of 8 people would pick 50 ton of corn a day. And we had 3 or 4 crews with the 40 people, and we ran about 200 ton of corn a day. But that corn would really fly, and the truck would never stop at all. The 2 guys in front would throw corn over the cab, and the 3 people on the sides. So we'd end up taking 8 rows, driving down the road and turn around, come down on the other 8 rows. That's how we pick corn. Subsequent to that, we got corn pickers. The first picker was a 2-row mounted on a Model H International tractor. And then they went the next step. They made self-propelled corn pickers that had their own power generation. And they started out with 4-row, and then we ended up with 6 or 8 rows. Now, with a 36-inch row that corn was normally planted on, you couldn't handle 8 rows because you'd have 24 feet of. So we cut the rows down to 18 inches and increased the plant spacing because the acreage would only handle about 20,000 plants per acre. So when you had 18 inches, you had to double the spacing. But the head of the machine had the 6 or 8 rows, and they would go down the row and pick all 6 rows. I think we'll have pictures of that later on when you get into the overseas work. Then we had the combines, we had the corn pickers, then they came up with a bean picker. And the bean picker was just almost like a pea viner. They would put a head on it with fingers, and the fingers would rotate and pick the beans off the plant where the the peduncle, whatever it is, on the end of the bean would hook on that teeth and get thrown into the machine. So that's how we mechanized the operation. And of course, after we had the corn picker, then we didn't need the Hannigan or the Barbadians. And one night, with 40 guys in the labor camp, you could expect trouble. So I asked them if they wanted to go to a stock car race at Plymouth, that's 7 miles away. And believe it or not, I took the 1.5-ton truck that we used to haul corn with sideboards on, put 40 people in the back of that truck, and drove down to Plymouth. Got there, of course, nobody had any money. I had to buy 40 tickets, and they had a blast at the stock car race. And then I brought them back to the labor camp. I wouldn't think of doing that today, but
Is that where they have the Road America course today?
that's in Elkhart Lake.
That's right.
This is at the fairgrounds at Plymouth, and it was exciting to go to a stock car race and just beat up the cars. Anyhow, we're in the 70s now, and I think I've been promoted to director of operations, and by this time I learned how to stay out of trouble by staying out of other people's territory. When they got to Larson, they had an engineering department, they had a raw product department that took care of buying the seed and so forth. They had a sales department. The sales department consisted of one man in charge of branded veg oil, another one in charge of the Fresh Like merchandise, another one that was in charge of industrial sales, and each one of those department heads would make the plans for the sales of that particular division. They would come up with how many cases they need. And we were fairly scientific. We had a 5-year plan that we come out with every year, and I would write most of that plan, take the requirements that the sales department said they needed, and I would say what we'd have to do engineering-wise or plant-wise, and if we needed a new plant or added addition onto our bean operation, engineering would come in and make the plans for it and see to it that it got built. I did get into some trouble with engineering because they were in charge of capital projects that we arranged when we met with the plant people, and we would come up with maybe $3 million worth of capital projects, and engineering would put those projects in effect, and any amount over the $3 million that we had approved, they would charge it to expense, and that was my expense. So we had some, I think that's the time the president called us into the office. I don't know if I mentioned this before. He called us into the office and told us in no uncertain terms that that was the last time he was going to see both of us in that office at the same time. I said, okay, so we... But it was after we developed the 4-year plan or the 5-year plan, we would get together and have a 2-day meeting in Green Bay and go over all the plans, and each plant manager would have a chance to get up there and give his spiel on what was going on in their plant and so forth. So that's how we ended up growing. Fresh Light would say we need another 50,000 cases of Fresh Light corn. So can we do it in our existing plants, or must we buy a plant? So as a result, we ended up buying the Cambria plant in 1974, and we bought the Darien plant in 1979. And I don't know if I told the story on that, buying that plant or not. Did I tell that story?
Where?
When we bought, I saw in the Wall Street Journal one morning that the Darien plant of Libby, McNeil and Libby was for sale. Did I tell that story or not? I said to my boss, let me go down and take a look at that plant. He said, I don't want you to go down there. I said, please, just take me a day, I'll go down there and take a look at it. He said, I don't want you to go down there because you're going to come back and say we should buy that plant. And we had just bought the Cambria plant 5 years earlier. Okay, he said, you go down there. So I went down there, Darien, just a beautiful plant on nice level fields, good soil, good area for pea production, and they were running peas. I think they had some lima beans and corn. I couldn't get to a telephone fast enough. We didn't have cell phones. And I said to my boss, we have to buy that plant. He said, I knew that was going to happen. So 2 weeks later, we were in Chicago meeting with Rich Burstead, vice president of Libby, McNeil and Libby, and we negotiated. But we had to get some onerous things out of their labor contract. And I said to my boss, we can't buy that plant unless we get those onerous things out. They had some real expensive severance packages there for all employees, and we were going to lay some people off. We were going to reshuffle the production and so forth. And I said, I think we can pull it off. He said, well, we want to sign the deal on Saturday or whatever day it was. So I and our labor man went down there and we negotiated with the union contract. And at 11 o'clock at night, we came to an agreement with the union. And I said, would you guys like to have a dinner? Yes. So we went out to a restaurant at 11 o'clock at night, and I said to Norm Foltz, do you still have the Libby credit card in your pocket? He said, yes. I said, I think Libby should buy this dinner. So we had a nice dinner. My labor man and I drove all the way back to Green Bay. We got back about 1 o'clock in the morning. We printed up the contract, got right back in the car and drove down there, and we met with the whole staff, told them what we're going to do, and they voted en masse to approve the contract. Then I called my boss and said, we got a contract. He said, that was cutting it kind of close, wasn't it? I said, I told you I thought we could get it. So they signed the contract either that day or the next day. It was kind of exciting time. Then in 1982, we bought the Fairwater plant from American Stores. American Stores had a captive plant that they used to produce products for Jewel Tea. And we bought that plant. It had, I think, produced about 60 million pounds of frozen peas and corn. And in a couple of years' time, we quadrupled that production. We went up to 64 million pounds of peas and corn. We even froze cranberries during the off season from cranberry producers. That was just an in and out deal. And that turned out to be a good acquisition. So now to staff all these places, you ended up doing some funny things. Pete Lemieux graduated from the University of Wisconsin in food science, and he had worked for us seasonally, and he came to me, he said, I want a job where someday I can be plant manager. I said, well, we don't have any openings except a maintenance supervisor at our Brillion plant. If you want to take a toolbox and be the maintenance supervisor, the job's open. He said, I'll take it. Well, he ended up years later being the director of operations. My son-in-law, Jim Fickert, came out of college and he had trouble finding a job. I said, you want to go being a maintenance man at Brillion, just a paid hourly worker, get a toolbox and we'll give you a job there. And he ended up as plant manager of the Fairwater plant when we took the previous plant manager and brought him to Green Bay as an assistant director of operations. And Pete Lemieux, the guy who started out as maintenance supervisor, came up to Green Bay as a production supervisor. Then he went down to the Fort Atkinson plant to become plant manager. And he had followed Scott Rambo. Scott Rambo was hired in the quality control department, became head of the research at Larson Company. And I thought he'd be a good production man. He had a PhD in food science. So he went down to Fort Atkinson as a plant manager, then I brought him up to Green Bay as my assistant to work into the production supervisor. And I thought to myself that he's got a PhD in food science. He really shouldn't be in production. He should be in research. Now, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but Dean Foods, we met with the Dean Foods people. And just a couple of weeks earlier, I met George Muck, M-U-C-K. He was the director of research and quality control at Dean Foods, and they lost their director of research. So I called George. I said, we got a great candidate for you for that job. He said, I just hired somebody for the job. I said, well, will you at least interview Scott? Because he would be a good man. He's got a PhD, which is required for that job. And I think you would do a bang-up job for you. Okay, he said, send him down. So I talked to Scott. I said, Scott, we have an opportunity for you to get into the research department, probably head of the research department at Dean Foods. So he went down there, and George Muck called me back. He said, great guy. He said, I wish I'd have interviewed him before, but I hired the other fellow. I said, well, keep his information on file in case something happens. Believe it or not, 2 days later, George Muck called me. He said, the guy we hired's wife doesn't want to move. Can we have Scott? I said to Scott, you got a job if you want to. So he went to Chicago to work as a head of research for Dean Foods and did a bang-up job. Now, I've talked to Scott today and asked if I could include these comments in our interview, and he said, I would be appreciative if you would. So he did an excellent job, and he retired as the director of research, and George Muck told him, if you had been younger, you could have taken my place when I retired, but he was just a little bit out of the age deal. So you can tell there's a lot of shifting of personnel. By the time I retired, I found out, hey, most of these people I either moved up from another position or hired somebody new. So then I didn't have any trouble stepping on any toes because I was the stepper. Anyhow, I thought that might be interesting to bring up those stories.